Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to all of you, especially our 1441 Foundation members. We're delighted you could join us today for this special webinar on some of the challenges facing the world economy and entrepreneurs in particular. Should you have any questions during the course of the hour, please use the Q&A box to send these through. Our speakers will try to get through as many as possible at the end. It's a tremendously exciting time for entrepreneurship at King's. 6 years ago, we launched the King's Entrepreneurship Prize, led by Stuart Lyons, and since then it's gone from strength to strength. For those not familiar with it, the prize aims to encourage the development of entrepreneurial ideas and concepts, where creativity and know-how can be converted into sustainable commercial and, importantly, social benefits. This year, we had a stronger range of entries than ever, and the first prize was awarded jointly to two fantastic female entrepreneurs who are building ambitious businesses that have the potential to change millions of lives for the better. I believe two of the winners are among the audience this afternoon, and our congratulations to you. King's is increasingly embracing entrepreneurship and business as academic disciplines in collaboration with the Cambridge Judge Business School. Tim Flack, our senior tutor, will talk a little bit more about this new direction for the college in a moment. Giving people the space and the freedom to do their best work, bringing great minds together to collaborate and exchange ideas, encouraging curiosity and creative thinking, these are all the hallmarks of King's and part of what makes this space so special. We are the forefront of entrepreneurship in Cambridge. King's has always been willing to break new ground. Now we want to take that further. Fostering innovation is one of the 4 priorities of the King's campaign, and it will be fundamental to our future. And I look forward to talking further about all this in the open session at the end. But now it's my very great pleasure to introduce Mervyn King, Lord King of Lothbury, our keynote speaker this afternoon. Mervyn served as Governor of the Bank of England for 10 years, from 2003 to 2013. He's currently the Alan Greenspan Professor of Economics and Professor of Law at New York University, and also Emeritus Professor of Economics at the LSE. Earlier this year, he was appointed Chair of the Philharmonia Orchestra. He's a distinguished and successful author. His latest book, Radical Uncertainty, was published in March this year to great acclaim. And he is, of course, a King's alumnus. But the rumors, however, that we named the college after him are sadly incorrect. We're tremendously grateful that he could be with us today to open the proceedings and to share his thoughts on entrepreneurship and uncertainty. Mervyn, thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be back at King's, even if only virtually. Well, this year of all years, I don't need to remind you of the importance of uncertainty. None of us a year ago expected that COVID-19 would be dominating our lives. And of course, it's been a tremendous opportunity for entrepreneurs. Indeed, we have all come to depend upon entrepreneurs. We've been waiting and hoping that people will develop a vaccine. But for the scientists to discover a vaccine is one thing, but the ability to manufacture it in sufficient magnitudes, to transport it, not just within the UK, but around the world, and to deliver a mass vaccination program requires entrepreneurial and managerial skills of a very high order. And of course, many entrepreneurs working outside the medical field will have contributed to the effort and will have produced other ideas that will come to the fore in years to come. It's a bit of a truism to say that innovation and entrepreneurship are essential to economic growth. Frankly, nothing else drives economic growth. Rising living standards depends on new ideas, new products, new processes, new ways of doing things. Next year, in 2021, we will be celebrating the centenary of 2 really very important books. The first, by Frank Knight from Chicago, was a book called Uncertainty, Risk and Entrepreneurship, in essence. And he was writing about why it was that it was uncertainty that drove entrepreneurs. The idea before had really been that uncertainty was a rather unpleasant thing that we had to cope with, a bit of a nuisance, really. But Knight was fundamentally convinced that it was the uncertainty about the future that created opportunity for entrepreneurs to design new products and processes that hadn't existed before. In the same year, Maynard Keynes, a Kingsman, of course, published his fellowship dissertation, which he'd taken many years to revise before publishing as a book, on a treatise on probability. And the essence of Keynes's book, which his ideas he refined over subsequent years, was that probability is something that is not easy to relate to actual events in the world. It's an abstract concept, and it may not apply to many events in the world. Later on, Keynes was much more explicit, even than Frank Knight, about the fact that as far as the future is concerned, there are many things we simply don't know, and we should admit we don't know, rather than pretend that we can attach probabilities to them. That thought was of great importance relatively recently when President Obama was in the White House, and he was asked in the Situation Room to decide on whether or not to send the Navy SEALs in to the compound in Pakistan to capture or kill bin Laden. And after the failures of intelligence in the Iraq War, Congress mandated the CIA advisors that they had to present their intelligence reports in the form of probabilities. So when President Obama asked the people in the Situation Room, was the man in the compound? There was someone there. The question is, who was it? They answered, well, I think it's a 90% chance that it's bin Laden. And someone else said, no, I think it's 60% chance it's bin Laden. Someone said 75%, someone 40%. And as President Obama said afterwards in various interviews, pretending that we could represent the information we had in a probabilistic form proved extremely unhelpful. It confused the issue. The man in the compound either was bin Laden or he wasn't. And what President Obama wanted to know was to get a feel for why they thought it might be him, not have arbitrary probabilities thrown at him. Now, uncertainty about the future comes from lack of information. Sometimes we can resolve that lack of information by finding out more about the event. But sometimes we may even be able to express the uncertainty in the form of probabilities, like drawing colored balls out of an urn or tossing a coin. When we go to the casino and gamble, we may know the odds because this is an event that's continuously repeated. But most of the problems we face in the world, and certainly the problems facing entrepreneurs, are not repetitions of events that we've seen occur many times in the past. We know something, but not enough about the future. Entrepreneurs really do more than create completely new goods that we haven't yet envisaged. They also come up with improvements that make an idea work in practice, or make an idea that seems a good one in principle, but hard to make work in practice, economically efficient and profitable. These are the things that entrepreneurs can do that transform our lives. Matthew Boulton, who was the person who worked with Watt to make the steam engine, was a classic entrepreneur. He continuously improved processes. He actually, in terms of the coinage of this country, reduced counterfeiting significantly by developing engineering processes that enabled the coins to be much harder to counterfeit. And in 1804, he devised a process for solving a problem that the Bank of England had been facing for some years. In the late 18th century, the British Navy captured Spanish ships, and on those ships were a stock of coins with the head of the Spanish king on them. And we thought it'd be a good idea to reuse these coins as coinage in the UK. Unfortunately, the processes available at the time enabled that overstamping not to remove the head of the Spanish king, but only to put a small head of George III in the middle of the coin. But good old Matthew Boulton solved that problem. His engineering skills enabled him to completely overstamp the head of the Spanish king, giving rise to the well-known couplet, "The bank to make their Spanish dollars pass stamped the head of a fool on the neck of an ass, the head of the fool being George III and the neck of an ass being the Spanish king. So uncertainty is at the heart of entrepreneurship. For many years, economists have really overlooked that. They've tried to find theoretical ways to tame uncertainty, and they've tamed it in two ways. First, by writing down a long list of all the possible things that could occur in the future, and to regard that as an exhaustive description of uncertainty for the future. And secondly, to assume that everyone can assign a probability, a subjective probability, to the probability that these different events will actually take place. Now, this is taming uncertainty in a way that's really unrealistic. We clearly don't know all the things that could happen in the future. We certainly can't assign probabilities to them all. But it was another Kingsman, Frank Ramsey, who in the 1920s decided that there was an argument that would enable him to prove to people that individuals could assign subjective probabilities to all these future events. And that was by asking people at what odds they would make bets on those events. And provided that they made bets in a way that didn't guarantee that they would lose money, one could then argue that these probabilities, at which the odds at which they would bet, would reveal the subjective probabilities which they attached to all these possible future events. That idea has been taken up by economists, and it's at the heart of the argument that most modern economics is based on, which is that we can write down the list of possible future events, and people do assign probabilities. And so they can ask the question, well, if a particular event occurs, I know how happy I will be in those circumstances. I know what my utility will be in those circumstances. If I multiply that by the probability of the event occurring and add it up across all events, then I'll get some expected value of my utility. And I can go about optimizing my behavior. This is what modern economics is based on. But people don't assign probabilities to all future events for very good reasons, because they won't bet on most things. And the reason is that they don't have the information to take bets. And if someone did want to make a bet with them, they'd be well advised not to. In fact, the main critique of modern economics was suggested in that wonderful American musical Guys and Dolls. In the 1950s, it was turned into a film with Marlon Brando as Sky Masterson and Frank Sinatra as his friend and betting colleague, Nathan Detroit. And when Nathan Detroit, Frank Sinatra, asked Marlon Brando, "Do we have a bet?" Marlon Brando responds as follows. He said, "I'm going to tell you," he said, "I'm not going to bet you." He said, "I'm going to tell you the advice my father gave me when I was a young boy. My father said to me, 'Son, I can't give you large amounts of money. I can't send you for a good education to King's College, Cambridge.' Well, that bit I made up, but anyway, to Harvard or wherever. But I can give you, son, a piece of advice that will be more valuable than any of the education you will get. One day, my son, a man will come to you and he will show you a pack of cards on which the seal has not yet been broken. He will say to you, 'I bet you that I can make the Jack of Spades jump out of this pack of cards with the seal unbroken and squirt cider in your ear.' Son, you do not take that bet, because if you do, as sure as anything, you'll end up with an ear full of cider. You shouldn't bet on things that you don't really understand, something that was clearly forgotten by all those people who bought complex financial instruments in the run-up to the financial crisis." So uncertainty is at the heart of what goes on in an economy. Maynard Keynes understood from Kings that a market economy is not self-stabilizing, that there are waves of optimism and pessimism which lead to booms and busts. And a market economy can't easily eliminate that. What we need to do is to embrace the idea of radical uncertainty and think it through. There are risks in the world, And for a startup or an entrepreneurial firm, the risk may be that it's going to be difficult to get funds and finance. We have to manage that risk to try and put in place the financing options before embarking on an expensive startup process. But as far as uncertainty is concerned, that is something that we really should embrace. Sometimes at graduation ceremonies, students say to me, you know, I'm embarking on the world, but I'm very worried because the future is so uncertain. And I say to them, you should be really thankful for that. Because if I could give you a list of all the jobs that you might hold down in the future and the probabilities attached to that, if I could give you the names and addresses of all the people who could be your life partners and the probabilities attached to them, you would go home bored and dispirited and depressed, because all the excitement of the future that awaits you will have gone. And on a more trivial level, if I could give each one of you on this webinar a list of the Christmas presents that you're going to receive with probabilities attached to all to those possible Christmas presents, all the fun of Christmas would disappear. So new ideas, new products, uncertainty, all of these things are at the heart of entrepreneurship and constitute the spice of life. So to entrepreneurs and those who want to be entrepreneurs watching, I would simply say, go for it. Thank you, Michael.
Mervyn, thank you very much indeed. That was great. And much food for thought. I'm very pleased you were able to refer to Frank Ramsey, one of our finest philosophers and economists. I hope you're staying with us for the rest of the session, and there'll be an opportunity for participants to ask Mervyn questions at the end, and please do add your questions to the Q&A as and when you think of them. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Kamiar Mohaddes, who's going to talk about some of the economic consequences we may expect to see coming out of the pandemic. Kamiar is a fellow in economics and is the first Cambridge Judge Business School academic to be elected to the Fellowship at King's. It's really good that we've managed to attract him to the college. It's very good that he's going to talk to us today. Kamiar, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to share my screen with you. I have a few slides. I hope you can see them here. Thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this panel. I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of forecast that we're thinking about the COVID and what sort of implications they have. So as you know, the world has seen many crises over the last few decades. We've had the oil shocks in 73, 74. We had the 78, 79 oil shocks and the global financial crisis in 2008, 09, which I'm sure is fresh in people's minds. These real and financial shocks clearly impacted entrepreneurs in particular regions. But simultaneously, actually, these shocks created significant opportunities for small and medium-sized enterprises in many parts of the world. But this time is very different because for the first time since the Great Depression, the world is experiencing what is a truly global shock, involving simultaneous disruptions to both supply and the demand in an interconnected world economy. And the extreme uncertainty that Lord King was talking about is clear here, because the extreme uncertainty about the path, the duration, the magnitude, etc., has created a vicious cycle of dampening business and consumer confidence and leading to job losses, reduction in investment at the global level, and creating significant challenges for small and medium-sized enterprises. So I want to share with you some of the forecasts with some of my colleagues at the International Monetary Fund, Dallas Fed, University of Southern California, and Johns Hopkins University, where we try to address the key challenges that policymakers have today and empirical economists like myself in understanding the size of the COVID shock, the uncertainty surrounding any forecast of the COVID shock, and etc. So let me share with you how we see things evolving. So this figure looks very complicated, but it actually isn't very complicated. The solid lines, I hope you can see them, are sort of the medium responses for real GDP here following the COVID shock. And the bounds, the different colors, represent the likely outcomes. And so as you can see, there's a huge uncertainty about recovery. So uncertainty around these forecasts are mainly pervasive because of the severity and duration of the shock, the global spillovers that they create, the financial market volatility that they have created, the ability of policy actions to protect firms and households in certain countries but not in others, and obviously the success of the pharmaceutical interventions that we've had 3 good news this last week to contain the spread of the coronavirus globally. So, but what this graph shows is that the COVID pandemic is likely to shave off about 3% of global GDP. We are comparing this to the case that, in the absence of the COVID shock. So we are 3% below that. And as you can see, this is really a big shock to some advanced economies. So we're looking at 2 percentage points below pre-crisis path of GDP for the euro area, but for the UK and the US is significantly larger. For US is about 6.5 percentage points. So but what you notice is that the economic consequences for China is very different. And I think is in line with what most economists thought would happen globally and even in the advanced economy. So they're very quick V-shaped recovery, what we are expecting. So why is that the case? Why is China different? So this is a photo of a couple of thousand people packed shoulder to shoulder with no face masks. It's actually from the Wuhan Maya Beach water park in the middle of August in this year, 2020. I like this photo because it illustrates how the Chinese experience has been different compared to the rest of the world. So in terms of the speed of economic recovery, China has been very fast and is an exception because most of the country, if you remember, had reopened by early April. And also the size of inward spillovers are lower. And most importantly, the global financial crisis, what we noticed following the global financial crisis or other crises, is that the service sector recovered much faster than manufacturing. But this time around, manufacturing is recovering much, much faster. I'm going to stop there, and just one note is that in August 2020, Bill Gates said that COVID-19 pandemic will be over by the end of 2021. While this is true, what our results and of other colleagues suggest that the economic costs of the pandemic are going to be persistent, they're going to be overall negative, and they're going to affect all countries. And the pandemic has brought huge challenges for small and medium-sized companies and entrepreneurs globally. And given the economic outlook over the next year or year and a half, it's likely that these challenges faced by entrepreneurs and small companies will unfortunately not go away anytime soon. So I'll stop there, and I want to introduce our next 2 speakers. First up, we're going to have 2 speakers. First up, we're going to have Dr. Shailendra Vyakarnam, and he's an educator, mentor, and entrepreneur. And in addition to his academic work, through which he has actually 2 recent books, one of which is called the Scale Up Manual, he's also supervised several students, doctoral students and other students, and has pioneered education for entrepreneurship, distinct from about entrepreneurship. And you might know that Shai founded the postgraduate diploma in entrepreneurship, and which is now what the judge is the master's in entrepreneurship. And it's fantastic because, as you know, masters in entrepreneurship, we have many of the MST entrepreneurship students from the job as members of King's. And Shai is also an associate member of the senior combination room and one of the judges on the Lions Den. And he's a mentor for many of the students. Shai will tell us why entrepreneurship is a social movement and not just an activity. And after Shai, we will have Dr. Tim Flack, who is a fellow of King's and very importantly, our senior tutor. In the university, Tim is a member of the electrical group in the electro engineering division and works particularly on electric machines and drives and on numerical simulation of electromagnetic fields. And I'm super excited because Tim will talk about entrepreneurship and business at King's. Over to you, Shai.
Thank you very much, Kamiar. 2 great talks so far, and certainly setting the context for what I would like to talk about, which is about entrepreneurship as a social movement, going beyond definition as an activity. I'm inspired a little bit by the talk that the late Professor Willie Brown gave at a talk some few years ago, when he argued that the whole kind of change that happened after 1991 when the Berlin Wall came down caused two distinct economic systems to somehow collapse into the one. So there was what he would describe as a closed supply side system on one side of the wall and the open capitalist system on the other side, which meant that there were previously 1.5 billion or so workers on each side, each within their own systems. But after the wall came down, suddenly you had about 3 billion people more or less competing for the same scarce resources and markets. So this massive sea change that we see still going on in different ways through migrations of people, through the movement of capital, globalization of ideas, markets, and resources. So ever since about 1991, which I think was probably one appropriate level, from my own career point of view, I think it might have started a bit earlier with the previous Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, and the whole kind of Reaganomics, when capitalism and private sector were seen as much more clear drivers of change and less government and more private was involved. But I will take Willie Brown's timeline as distinctive. So this created a movement for self-reliance and the need for seizing opportunities, because it was driven by a simple fact or two that we could no longer rely on the traditional big businesses, the Ford Motor Companies, if you will, of this world, or to become large-scale employers to create the millions of jobs that were needed. Not least if we looked across the Middle East and North Africa, where maybe 85 to 100 million new jobs are required within a decade. So, how do you expect, or how does one expect large organizations to do something of that sort? So this realization of the need for self-reliance and movement is also causing all kinds of pressures. So there are no jobs or few jobs available. So we have to go from being job seekers to thinking of ourselves increasingly as job creators. We got some help for this actually from the television and the media formats that have been coming up over the last couple of decades, celebrating endeavor of various kinds, whether it is with dancing or baking or gardening or becoming an apprentice to extravagant entrepreneurs. Whatever it was, we have an enormous amount of presence in the media across most countries, not just in the UK, where they provide an atmosphere of endeavor, of achievement. And in the end, the mindset issue begins to get addressed because the desire to succeed starts to overwhelm the fear of failure, which in our world of uncertainty, as Lord King has so well articulated, we need more the sense of self-belief and self-confidence that we can go off and grab opportunities when things around us are so difficult. This then has stimulated philanthropists, as indeed at King's, and corporates with their various accelerator programs that we see increasingly, local governments and agencies that have got involved with, right across the world actually, have all become involved in trying to see whether or not we could stimulate enterprise in one form or another. And indeed, I think what I have seen over the last 20 or so years is less reference to the growth of SMEs and more the growth of enterprise entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship. So the language also has changed in favor of our endeavor. I think this is really important. There's a little soundbite distraction here. When I was researching super growth companies many years ago, I went to Silicon Valley, as everyone does at one time or other. And I was asking questions about what they thought the barriers to growth might be for their small business. There's one individual who replied to me, "We're not a small business struggling to grow. We're just a big business starting small." And that mindset is really an important one and a real eye-opener for me about the differences between different types of enterprise I saw in the UK, maybe even in Europe and in the USA. That entrepreneur who said that to me was a gentleman called Eric Schmidt, who some of you will know as chair of Google. He wasn't there at the time, he was at another company. So we have this kind of idea of a shift in language, a shift in a sense of achievement, sense of the vicarious learning that we're getting from more and more entrepreneurs that are celebrated by institutions. And it is a long embraced need for change in mindsets and skill sets and even action sets that have been taking place through the courtesy of media, competitions, corporates, philanthropists, all piling in over the last 20 years. It is absolutely fabulous. At last, we're seeing a move away from the old school of seeking productivity and efficiency and group behavior, the end of what I would describe as Taylorism. Please God, let that be true. More towards individual aspiration and through that for the embracing of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial behaviors. On a more human level, coming down to our own situations, we're also see families embracing enterprise. Where in the old days, the families would be encouraging their sons and daughters to go find a job, a proper job, if you will. It's now that they understand that actually, you know, maybe it's okay to go start a company instead, or try to do that, because the barriers to entry have fallen. And the parents also can see that actually, you know, there are no jobs around. So what do? We do actually have to embrace enterprise entrepreneurship. So there's both this sort of a pull and a push towards entrepreneurship. We've got more role models. We've got more support systems in place. I mean, even a business plan competition, for example, got more accelerators and increasing ways of feeling like the risk has been reduced. And Cambridge particularly is really an interesting place because it's an environment in which you can take higher risks because failure is not seen as something bad. People see it as an endeavor. And this is one of the issues, cultural issues that I've seen in Cambridge over the last 20, 25 years that's been getting better and better all the time. I'm really delighted to be involved with it. So with this variety of support that's come our way, quality of support getting better and better, what better way now than to start a business? And this is why I would argue that entrepreneurship has clearly become much more of a social movement. And in our post-COVID world, at least for the UK, we need to look back maybe to some of the policies of the 1990s, where we had things like the Enterprise Allowance Scheme. And now when I see the Chancellor of the Exchequer promoting, you know, support schemes for retention of jobs, I would hope that at some point he gets advised to look at actually switching some of those policy measures to helping people to start companies, because even though we want to provide all this encouragement, we do need some practical support in that. So long ago, I suppose past crises, we saw a shift from manufacturing to services. COVID-19 has put paid to services. Where do we go next? Entrepreneurs will need to find that answer, working with corporates and governments, and to find a sensible way forward to what do we do now in the next 10 years. So I would say let's try and harness a social movement of entrepreneurship to find solutions to our present situation. Thank you. I think, Tim, you take straight on because you were introduced by Kamiar.
Thank you very much, Shai, and for your introduction earlier, Kamiar. So I'm here to briefly explain how we at King's have gradually embraced academic disciplines such as entrepreneurship and business, whilst retaining the old classics that you will no doubt be far more familiar with. The journey has been somewhat serendipitous, and so I don't think that any of the King's panelists would want to take any credit for some far-sighted master plan. Rather, it all started with Stuart Lyons' very generous donation that the Provost has already talked about, that funds an annual entrepreneurship competition, the final of which has become known as the Lions Den. So what this did, it brought a number of current fellows into regular contact with King's alumni who have a penchant for entrepreneurship. And at one of the competition shortlisting meetings, I mentioned that the Judge Business School was looking for partner colleges to accept students for its Master of Studies in Entrepreneurship. By this point, the Lions Den had run successfully for a number of years, and the benefits of King's involvement were tangible. So apart from giving us insight into some amazing proposals, entrepreneurship transcends all sectors of our community. And so what we'd find is that current undergrads, postgrads with commercially viable research projects, alumni, and even current King's Fellows were putting ideas into the competition. And so the time felt ripe for a rather modest proposal to the College Council of admitting up to 10 students a year to this course. But as I discovered, old attitudes die hard, and it did take some convincing to see this through. So what were the arguments that clinched it? The first one was it would add diversity to the community. So now many of you will be familiar with the idea of that chance conversation, often with somebody from a completely different discipline, sparking an idea that you'd never have thought of. When the melting pot of chance encounters consists mainly of academics, then those new ideas are often limited. So what the melting pot needed was some added spice. How about 10 new graduates per year, all bursting with ideas and having the ambition to turn those ideas into reality? Second was that King's could play a part in encouraging our entrepreneurship students to make their future ventures environmentally and socially responsible ones. And this is something that Shai has just alluded to. Third, being connected to people with the entrepreneurial spirit will provide interesting opportunities for other students at King's. Things like networking, summer internships, even employment opportunities. And fourth, we felt that we had something at King's to offer our entrepreneurship students that's rather unique through things like regular seminars and mentoring by our alumni. So I'm delighted to report that now we're over a year in, these predicted benefits are turning into reality. So much so that Council very recently agreed to a new venture. We're now going to admit 5 graduate students per year to the Executive Masters in Business Administration course. So this is another Judge Business School course, and this adds a dollop of subtly different spice into the melting pot. Many of the candidates for King's membership will be seasoned business people, possibly even CEOs of companies. So they will bring maturity and business acumen to the mix. This initiative was driven by our first ever fellow from the Judge Business School, who you've already heard from, Kamiar Mohaddes. So in summary, in less than 5 years, King's has moved from its rather traditional educational base to embracing entrepreneurship and business as academic disciplines. And so far, I'm delighted to say this has been a great success. Well, thank you all for listening. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Gemma Chandratillake. Gemma matriculated at King's in 1997 in natural sciences. And after an MPhil at the LMB, she moved to the west coast of the US, training further in molecular genetics and genetic counseling at the University of Washington, UCSF, and Stanford. As genetic sequencing technologies rapidly advance, she is drawn into the genomics startup space, working to try to make sense of all the data for applications in healthcare. We've recently welcomed Gemma back as one of the panel of judges for the King's Entrepreneurship competition, and she's here today to speak about the Entrepreneurship Prize and biotech. So over to you, Gemma.
Thanks very much, Tim. It's really great to be here this evening. So it was an enormous pleasure for me to participate in the King's Entrepreneurship competition as a member of the Lions Den this year. The experience was really fascinating from start to finish. So first, I'd like to reflect on the competition with a few observations before broadening out to comment on future developments in the life sciences more generally. So the first thing to note is how many entries to the competition there were. 49 entries is certainly a pretty healthy number in any circumstance. And while this stands at around 2/3 the number of entries of previous years, I think that is pretty understandable. And actually, 50 entrepreneurial teams from the King's community in the middle of a global pandemic is testament to both the level of entrepreneurship at the college and the positive experience of participation in the competition for entrance. So those 49 teams represented enormous diversity in the projects that were proposed, which I can't possibly cover in the 5 minutes I have today. But equally diverse was the makeup of the teams themselves, with undergraduates, graduates, postdocs, fellows, and alumni all participating. Many entries reflected King's values of environmental and social responsibility. And of particular note was the strong representation of female team leads, with 21 of 28 entries being led by women. This is particularly striking given the wider UK context as identified in the Rose Review, where women are half as likely to start businesses as men, It's also important to say that, without any explicit intention from the Lions in the Den, all 3 cash prize winning teams were led or co-led by women. Again, the Rose Report provides the national context where here in the UK, only 1% of venture funding goes to female teams. I believe this result is a natural reflection of King's progressive culture. During the course of the competition, it was fantastic to see the connections created between students, fellows, and particularly alumni. Even if an entry didn't progress, there was a good chance that it would pique someone's interest and that a connection would follow, helping to move that entrepreneur forward in their endeavour. Given that women are generally less likely than men to know other entrepreneurs or to have access to sponsors, mentors, or professional support networks, this aspect of the competition in itself can be seen as a valuable addition to the UK startup ecosystem. I'll move on now to comment on the area that I'm most familiar with, that is the life sciences. So, given the history and expertise of Cambridge in genetics, being the location of the Genome Campus with the Sanger Institute and the European Bioinformatics Institute right on our doorstep, we probably expect to see some entries with a genomic focus, which was indeed the case. However, what was really interesting and exciting for me as a biologist was actually the diversity of the entries that fell into the life sciences category. I was particularly struck by the number of strong entries that straddled life sciences and material science. In this respect, there were proposals that involved innovative materials being applied to address problems in healthcare, and also innovative materials being created through biology. With the advent of genomics and other omics technologies at the fore, much current academic research is directed at the collection and interrogation of large omic and healthcare data sets. It was therefore exciting to see entrants to the competition identify and aim to address healthcare needs in under-researched areas through consumer platforms. As to the future of biotech more generally, the word on the street is going to be big data. The scientific and technological advances of the last decade in terms of genetic sequencing, induced pluripotent stem cells, and CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology are all coming together to facilitate more questions being asked and answered in timeframes only imaginable before, with the generation of biological data accelerating as never before. These technologies enable not only development of more personalized and targeted treatments, but also constant screening and monitoring of disease states. Data, data, data. Making sense of it all provides enormous potential for innovation. With Cambridge's historical strengths in both biosciences and the information sciences, it's no surprise that we see this type of innovation right here in the Cambridge ecosystem, with companies like Helix and BitBio both having raised substantial Series B rounds. So, in conclusion, I'm excited about the interfaces, where biology meets material science and where biology meets data science. The scale of potential already feels so different from when I graduated 20 years ago. I don't think it's possible to exaggerate the opportunities of the next 20 years. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Gemma. That was super interesting. We're going to move on to the question part of this session. So if I'll be looking through the Q&A box. So if you have any questions, please do put them there, and I will. And if you want them to direct it to a particular person, please do write their names, and I will communicate that to the panelists. So let me kickstart with the first question to Lord King. So there's a question about your views on Keynes and Keynes' followers, and their views on financialization of the economy, and in particular their opinion against austerity as a measure against crisis. So over to you, Lord King.
Well, I think that if Keynes were able to answer himself, he would say that his attitude towards the use of fiscal policy would depend entirely on the circumstances and the context in which the question was being posed. And the question asked really about contrast with 2010 versus today. And I think this is a very interesting contrast. And I do think there is a worry that I have, certainly, that the Treasury view of the 1930s is being put forward again in the present circumstances in ways that don't necessarily seem appropriate. So the purpose would be of fiscal policy as a means of stimulating demand would be in order to ensure that the economy can run and full employment can exploit all its potential. Back in 2010, the circumstances were so different from today in a number of areas. The first was that the need then was to rebalance the economy. And after a 25% depreciation of sterling, the biggest depreciation in real terms since the Second World War, it was appropriate to offset the stimulus to demand that would come from that depreciation through higher exports and lower imports by pulling back on domestic spending. And that implied a fiscal consolidation. What was also different was that in 2010, Britain had the biggest budget deficit in the G20, and the government could borrow at interest rates the same rate as that of the Italian government, which put us in a rather unfortunate position in the league table. Now, fast forward to today, we entered COVID-19 at the beginning of this year with a small budget deficit. Indeed, if you take out interest payments, not that far from zero. And the government today can borrow at interest rates which are very close to zero and allowing for inflation at negative rates. What that means is that once we get past COVID-19, that if we were in a position at that point where the economy had returned to its previous level, now we don't know whether that's going to happen. Certainly this is not the moment to be making decisions on fiscal policy. But if we were able to get there, and if the government didn't change its spending plans relative to those that were in place in 2019, then there would be no need for tax rises or spending cuts in order for the ratio of national debt to national income slowly and steadily to start to fall back. Now, it's quite likely that there will be higher spending plans, but then the need for tax increases is not to repay the additional debt that's been incurred as a result of providing support for businesses this year, but in order to finance the higher expenditure in 2022, 23, and so on. And that is very different. So I think the idea of massive fiscal consolidation, the idea that the numbers that were presented this week by Rishi Sunak are eye-watering, and we should be terrified of them, is a misunderstanding of the need to provide support to the economy and the ability of national debt to come down, provided the economy can grow at a faster rate than the interest rate at which the government can borrow. That was not true in 2010, and it is true today. I don't like the word austerity, because austerity has a connotation of putting people into poverty and of cutting back on important public services. Austerity in the sense of fiscal consolidation, when there is no other source of demand to offset it, which is what's happened in Southern Europe, and I think is what would happen if we were to impose significant fiscal consolidation now, would be a very bad thing. But austerity in the sense of pulling back on public spending is a sensible thing if the state of the economy demands it. So we don't want a word that is meant to be a word that has the same connotation irrespective of circumstances. We need to think our way through the problem.
Thank you very much for that. So actually, there's a question for me, which says, do you presume that the economic fallout from COVID measures-induced crisis in Europe will last longer than the 2008-09 crisis, considering the unprecedented government support throughout the world? So, yeah, I mean, I should be clear. We are not saying that the magnitude or the duration of the crisis is going to be as long as that following the great recession. And one of the reasons was just what Lord King was saying, was that we obviously have had and hopefully will continue having support for businesses, for households, to protect people's livelihoods and lives. And I'm hopeful that we've learned some lessons from actually the financial crisis, where people were extremely worried about that 2 GDP threshold effects. There was a very famous paper by Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt, who said that if our GDP of the UK GDP debt to GDP ratio went above 90%, then we all be in big trouble. And obviously, as you know, our debt to GDP ratio is much higher than that today, but we haven't seen this huge drop in economic activity. So I'm hopeful that we've learned some lessons from the global financial crisis and the Great Recession in dealing with the crisis. But as Lord King said, this crisis is very different than the ones that we previously observed. So no, I don't think that the duration will be as long, and hopefully with the swift deployment of the vaccines, etc., it will be dealt with quickly. Excellent. So I have another question for you, for Lord King. He says, this is a lesson for me. He says, you emphasize the dangers of attaching probabilities to uncertain events. But Kamiar did this immediately afterwards in predicting uncertain outcome of post-COVID. Have you any advice for me?
Well, very quickly, the answer is a brief one word of advice. Don't use your models to make forecasts, because we simply don't know what the future holds. Do use them to show us what are the crucial factors that will determine the outcome. In other words, how sensitive is the future to particular assumptions or parameters that we don't know a great deal about today. That, I think, is where the epidemiological models this year have gone very badly wrong. They've been used to make forecasts about the path of COVID-19. They can't predict the path of COVID-19 because the parameters that generate that path are things that we don't really understand or know a lot about. But what is important is that the models can help us know which are the key parameters that will determine the future path. Are there some parameters where it doesn't really matter what they are, the outcome isn't sensitive to them? And are there parameters where it really does matter that we have a good handle on it, in which case that's where we should focus our research effort to know more about those parameters. So models are helpful in order to understand the sensitivity of outcomes to assumptions, but they're no good at predicting the future.
Absolutely. In fact, in defense of what we're doing, we do, I mean, I gave you very brief, a few slides about it, but we do also look at, for instance, what would happen in the case of less stringent policies. So in the case of Sweden, where it was not mandatory to social distance, but people could choose to do so if they wanted. And we do show how the model changes. And in defense of the model as well, we try to attach some probability to what the events will happen, whereas international organizations such as the IMF will come out with one single number and say, economic activity will drop by 5% in 2020. We give some range, but yeah, well taken. Brilliant. Another question I have here, I don't know who on the panel wants to take it. Perhaps from an entrepreneurial point of view, is what will the impact of COVID be on the way we purchase goods, consumers, and potentially demand for particular, I suppose, sectors? Maybe Gemma, do you want to
take it?
Or Stuart?
I think I'm going to take that, because we then have to move and close up. I think we're all seeing what's happening in the retail trades. That retail stores are closing down. Landlords cannot fund their properties, and everyone is going to Amazon or Waitrose online or whatever. And what we've all learned about doing business in a remote way is extraordinary. It applies not just to retail business, but to this seminar, which would never have taken place in this form. Well, 6 or 7 years ago, the college asked me if I would support a tutorship in Latin and Greek. And I said, no, classics is what I was, business is what I became. I want to support an entrepreneurship program and fund an annual competition. Unfortunately, That idea coincided with the appointments of Mike Proctor as Provost and Lorraine Heedner as Development Director. And it looks as though we've got a success on our hands. So I do want to thank Mike for hosting the occasion, Lorraine for organizing it, and the impeccable planning and execution by Amy, Ingle and Felicity Brown and other members of the development team. You really are a fantastic team. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in 1 hour. Lord, I just want to sum up some of the points. Lord King's referred to the pioneering work of two great Kingsmen, John Maynard Keynes and Frank Ramsey, as well as Frank Knight and Matthew Boulton. And he's reminded us that without uncertainty, there can be no entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship, imagined by some as maximizing risk, is better seen in an age of unpredictability as maximizing opportunity while limiting risk by the assignment of probabilities. Don't risk an earful of cider. Knowledge and sound judgment are better allies than bets and guesswork. The greatest wealth destroyer of our generation has been COVID-19. In the USA and the UK, we pride ourselves as being superior economies. We've suffered a greater loss of lives and livelihoods than our major rivals. Well, the reason why is not to be debated here. It'll have to await public inquiries. But Kamiar has highlighted the impacts and economic consequences with which businesses must now deal. That 3% forecast fall in GDP that he referred to doesn't fall evenly, either on countries or businesses, and it places huge challenges on entrepreneurs. As Mike Proctor said, King's has a unique flavor among Cambridge colleges. We're intellectually curious, sometimes quirky, often driven. We want to believe in what we do and that what we do contributes to the well-being of the world. And Shailendra Vyakarnam very valuably has described the convergence of the closed and open supply systems in Germany after the wall came down and the pressures of globalization. And he's argued that entrepreneurship is a social movement, the engine by which the innovative ideas of individuals and small teams create economic dynamism, big businesses that start small and a financial support system with lower barriers to entry than in the past. Tim Flack's outlined the way in which King's, which is embracing this brave new world. And he's right, it's partly the collegiate atmosphere of King's that holds out so much promise for the future. And Gemma Chandratillake has delved beneath the surface and described how the King's initiative is stimulating some of our most brilliant minds to create sustainable social and commercial benefit, for example, through healthcare initiatives arising from the new biotechnologies. Gemma's a huge asset to our entrepreneurship panel. Well, it's been a privilege to play a part in bringing this program together. And once again, I'd like to thank Lord King, our organizers, our other speakers, and our audience, and to wish you a very good evening.
Thank you.
Stuart, thank you so much. I think we've come to the end of our session, but thank you very much all our participants and attendees, and thank you to the panelists who've given so much of their time.